Yes, so I'm Marcus Tomlin. I'm one of the people who's organised this event, and it's great to see so many people here. Just various things to mention just before we sort of get started and I introduce our two speakers for this session. We're really keen for this event to be as interactive as possible. And I know that's not always the most straightforward thing to achieve using some sort of online platform. And I know there are various ways of trying to make that happen online. I think the best way for us to sort of do that today is that if any of you have questions at any point during this session or any of the other sessions that are part of the workshop, if you enter them via the chat function, I think you're all probably familiar with Zoom. I think we've all become very familiar with it in recent months. But at the bottom of the Zoom screen, there's the little chat option. And if you click that, it opens it on the sidebar. And if you type your question in there and address it to everyone, what I'll try to do is just sort of gather together the questions that appear, and then I'll sort of ask them verbally to our speakers. I think that's probably the easiest way of doing it. So do please make use of that function. Let me just share my screen because I've just got a few sort of introductory slides that I'll whiz through pretty rapidly. So hopefully that's visible there. So just to make sure you're all in the right place at the right event, this is the first session in the virtual workshop that's called Mindful of AI, Language, Technology and Mental Health. And the various sessions that form part of this workshop are really focused on different aspects of the way in which artificial intelligence and mental health combine. And obviously this is a broad topic and it's one that's of particular contemporary relevance. That's one of the reasons why this workshop was something that we were keen to organise. So this is the first session in the workshop. So this is the one that focuses on social media and mental health. I know that some of you have also registered for other sessions as part of the workshop. So some of the themes that are addressed in this one may well connect to things that are discussed later today or also tomorrow. That's fine, you know, separating these sessions, we're not pretending that these topics are utterly disconnected. In fact, quite the opposite, we recognise that they're closely interconnected. So as I say, this is our starting point, but some of these issues may be discussed at subsequent, perhaps perspectives. Just to give you some context, this workshop's been organised by a group of us who are associated with a project that's based at Cambridge University in the UK. The project is called Giving Voice to Digital Democracies, and the subtitle, if you like, of the project is Social Impact of Artificially Intelligent Communications Technology. So really, we're just particularly interested in how modern AI-based communications technologies have a social impact. And obviously that's why this workshop is so relevant to that sort of broad theme. You can see a sort of rogues gallery there. The sort of names that you've got on that slide, that identifies the core team that are involved with this project. And as you can see, we come from a range of different disciplines, you know, linguistics and computational linguistics and information engineering and philosophy and various academic areas that in different ways connect to this broad area that the project is focused upon. You'll get to meet some of us during the course of this workshop. This idea of, you know, artificially intelligent communications technology, I think these days most people know what that involves, but this just gives a broad sense of it. So we tend to think of it as artificially intelligent systems that in some way involve language, either, you know, speech synthesis or speech recognition or some sort of language-based dialogue system or machine translation system, that kind of thing. And of course, these systems also extensively involve natural language processing, whether it's natural language generation, natural language understanding, or anything like that. And I suppose prototypical technologies of this kind are things like Siri and Alexa and Cortana, which are already very familiar modern technologies, I think. But we don't focus exclusively on those. We look at a wide range of other things as well. So just to give a bit of context specifically for this session, the COVID-19 pandemic, it's in recent months, it's been recognized as creating a mental health crisis as a result of lockdown, as a result of various restrictions that, of course, we've all experienced. You've got a couple of newspaper headlines there that sort of have addressed this problem. And social media activity has been particularly conspicuous during the pandemic, especially during lockdown. And one of the underlying questions is, what sort of impact does social media use have on our mental health? Now, there are sometimes claims made about the extent to which it influences our mental health, and often those claims emphasize negative elements. So some of the claims have been along the lines of, a heavy use or an excessive use of social media can increase the risk of depression, anxiety, loneliness, self-harm, suicidal thoughts, and as well. But developing a secure evidence base for these sorts of claims is perhaps slightly more difficult than people sometimes realize. That's perhaps something that's a little bit today. We also talk about social media as if it's some sort of, uniform thing, but something that's quite well known. It's relatively easy to sort of quantify things like this. We know that different types of social media are used by different demographics, and here are just some recent statistics that basically indicate that the distribution amongst just age groups of people who use Instagram is different. The distribution of age groups for people who use Facebook, for instance, see how these patterns change as you look at the different types of social media. One thing that many of these platforms have in common is that in various ways they've been purposely designed to be addictive. It's in the interests of these platforms for the users to spend a lot of time using them. This is one of the ways they make money. And of course, we all know of the concerns about data and how data is gathered and perhaps used or sold again for money-making purposes. So there is an addictive element to these technologies, and quite how that relates to the impact they have on our mental health is something that requires more extensive consideration, perhaps. It sometimes surprises people to think of social media in relation to AI, artificial intelligence, and yet social media platforms increasingly make quite extensive use of systems that we might want to classify as being associated with artificial intelligence. I'm not going to go through all of these exhaustively, but it can include things like generating content for social media, ads of a certain kind might be generated automatically using AI systems. And obviously, various posts can be analyzed to gauge an audience's response to a particular ad or post, or to detect a trend, things like that. So these are just some of the ways in which AI systems underlie social media platforms, even though as users we might not be fully aware of that. And so just to end with, really, these are some of the questions that you might want to think about while you're listening to the talks this morning. You might be interested in thinking about the roles that these automated systems, these AI-based systems, play in social media. I mentioned the addictive element already. Well, there's a large body of work on the psychology of addiction. How does that relate to media and our social media activity? Obviously, as we've said, it's often suggested that there are links between social media use and mental health, and that's something that I'm sure we'll discuss more extensively over the next hour or so. And then, while there's a lot of emphasis on the negative ways in which social media can affect our mental health, it may well be the case that there are potential positive benefits that social media can offer. That's something that often, but it's certainly something that we considered. And then, of course, there's the question of the future. You know, if we're looking ahead, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, even 10 years, how are these areas, how are these, these platforms likely to develop? And is that something that we should be planning for at this stage? Now, given this emphasis on social media and mental health, it may be that the talks in this session or in other sessions address topics that some of you find distressing as a result of your own personal experience. In the booklet that we've created for this event, we've got some contact details there in case that's of use. But I think it's important just to remind all of you that you're free to exit this session if you feel that you need to do that. So we hope that these topics will be handled in a sensible and sort of mindful way. But as I say, please feel free to exit the session if that seems beneficial for you personally. Okay, if I stop sharing those and let me introduce our speakers for this morning. There's been just a very slight change to the order of the schedule, not the personnel, just the order. So our first speaker this morning will be Amy Orben. So I'll introduce her, and then I'll introduce our second speaker, Michelle, before she gives her talk. We'll do it that way around. Okay, so Amy is a college research fellow at Emmanuel College here in Cambridge, and also a member of the Cognition and Brain Sciences unit, again here in Cambridge. She has many research interests, and some of them focus on the impact that modern communications technology is having on mental health, especially the mental health of adolescents. If you're familiar with her work, you'll know that she's unflinchingly realistic about the difficulty of reaching firm conclusions about such topics due to the lack of, as she puts it, high quality, robust and transparent evidence. Therefore, it's entirely appropriate that she's here to speak to us today. And we're very much looking forward to what you have to say to us, Amy. So thanks so much for agreeing to participate, and I'll hand over to you.
Yes, thank you, Marcus. Thanks for the kind introduction. I'm just going to go and share my screen. And I will, sorry, I always need to put my timer on. If not, I start going all over the place. But yes, thank you for having me. I'm going to talk today about screen time and social media and what we know. And we decided to swap the order because I'll be giving a bit of a broader level introduction, and then Michelle is going to go into more detail around the core kind of social media mental health and what we can do. And so we just thought it would be better this way. I apologize to Michelle. I just added some slides at the beginning. So I hope, it doesn't change my talk. I just thought that it would be nice in hearing the introduction. I thought it would be nice to actually start with a bit of an historical overview. So we've always had technological change, and it's part of us being human, of being a species that can develop and think of things quickly and think of new tools. And naturally, we are now at a point where the technological change is quicker, but it has always been the case that we've had new technologies that have gone into society and has started affecting people. And it also has been the case that we've often been very concerned about these new technologies. And so I think part of being a scholar in this area is also not just being sucked into kind of trying to figure out, for example, what social media is doing, but also to take that broader perspective and think a bit about what is the ecosystem that I'm working in. And so I'm just going to start with a very broad level overview of technological concern. And then I'll go into the details about what we know about social media. And I hope that will give people a better overview and maybe open some more discussions in terms of this whole 2-day workshop. So what actually first made me interested in history, I was trained in natural sciences here in Cambridge, so I'm very much in the sciences. What made me interested in history was reading this article at the end of my PhD in Oxford. This article was by Mary Preston, and she published this in 1941. Mary Preston was a pediatrician, and she studied about 117 children in California about how they reacted to radio dramas and movie dramas as well. And actually, 1940s was a time where radio was going through kind of a very intense boom, similar to social media is doing now. And what she found was that radio, these terrifying scenes on the radio, was having terrifying effects on children. It was inhibiting the effects of functioning of every organ in the body, and that most of them, actually the majority of the children, were severely addicted to radio dramas, and that most of them utilized this addiction to technology as an escape from reality, much as a chronic alcoholic does drink. It was interesting to me because I felt like I could just replace radio with social media, and the conversation would have been very similar to the one I had been having with colleagues over the last 4 years of my PhD. And this is not just one article. It's actually, I've just pulled out some quotes. This was another kind of quote about the radio at the time. "No locks will keep this intruder out, nor can parents shift their children away from it." And here in a parenting magazine, somebody noted that the radio is a device that is everywhere. We may question the quality of its offering for our children. We may approve or deplore its entertainments and enchantments, but we are powerless to shut it out. It comes into our very home and captures our children before our very eyes. I really truly believe that we could swap in social media here, and this could be published in a parenting magazine or now online, and nobody would really bat an eyelid. And I think that should raise questions in a way that hopefully we can keep in the back of our mind in this kind of morning session. Because what I argue is that these technologic panics are inherently cyclical. And it's not in press anymore. I copy pasted a slide from an old talk. This is now a paper that I have published about. But I think a lot of this social media debate needs to be seen in context, that we are normally concerned about new technologies. We are very quickly concerned about addiction, about children's leisure time, about changes to our most vulnerable populations. I think a crucial part of our work now is to differentiate, is now different? Will we laugh about our concern about social media in 20 years' time, like I laughed about how people were concerned about radio addiction? Or will we go back and say, actually, this was a really valuable conversation to have, because actually there was something we were concerned about. And so in this way, I want to introduce, social media. Is social media different? What do we know? Are these concerns just these concerns that pop up time and time again about any new technology? Or are they something more important to look at and to really get to the bottom of and to regulate? Part of this work and my work is to work with policymakers and try to figure out, is now different and what can we do? And kind of to put the last slide at the beginning, things are really complicated. And I'll go through a lot of different kind of things that make it more complicated throughout this talk. And actually, we've all seen this headlines, smartphones destroying generations, smartphones being as bad as obesity for children, smartphones making children sad, or that they're addictive like cocaine. And if we think about what we know, the first thing is that, okay, so if I open up any data set, cross-sectional, so a data set where we measure screen time in teenagers and also their well-being, that link, if we correlate those variables, that link is normally negative. So the adolescents that use more screens are also the adolescents that report a very kind of slightly lower well-being. And this is something that has been found in kind of systematic reviews of my own, but also systematic reviews of other psychologists published at this kind of in 2020. However, this is often what gets published and what gets the kind of, it's a significant correlation. So that catches the attention and actually goes quite far into politics and policy. However, we need to think further. And the first thing that complicates this negative link is that it's extremely small. My colleague always says, this is teeny tiny land. this link isn't, like the correlation between height and weight, which is quite large. It's actually really small. And we often forget to talk about effect sizes. We say, oh, it's a link is there, but we need to think about, is that link actually worthwhile to look at? Especially when we think about investing, millions of pounds into policy change. And to really put this into perspective, I'll use a paper that I wrote in my PhD. So this is the kind of correlation between technologies and well-being in teenagers. It has a very small correlation of negative 0.04. Naturally, this doesn't really tell us anything. I don't really know what this means. You don't know what this means. The people down the road don't know what it means, and probably most other scientists don't know what it means. We're very bad at grasping what an effect size is. So what me and my colleagues did is that we compared the correlation of technologies to well-being to correlation of other things with well-being in teenagers. So for example, if I'm left or right-handed, how does that correlate with my well-being? And it's very close to zero. We wouldn't really expect anything else, hopefully. If not, me as a left-handed person might be very sad or very, we don't really think that handedness has anything to do with well-being. Height and bicycle use were also ones that we kind of hypothesized shouldn't have a large relationship with well-being, and they have kind of a small positive relationship. So if you're a taller adolescent, you often score better on well-being, and if an adolescent that uses more bicycles, you also score a bit better. But wearing glasses has a more negative correlation with well-being than technology use. So if you're an adolescent that wears glasses, your well-being scores are often lower. Naturally, this makes us start to think about what are the causal relationships underneath. Do glasses really cause lower well-being? And we'll get to that. But it puts this effect size into perspective. We're not going to say, because of this result, we need to stop everybody wearing glasses. And I think, therefore, we also need to take the technology use correlation with a pinch of salt. We wouldn't say, we need to stop everybody using technologies from these results. And that's because the third complicating factor is bidirectionality. We need to think about, does this correlation mean that digital technologies causes lower well-being, just like wearing glasses causes lower well-being? Well, we don't know. That sort of information is not there in those sorts of correlations. It could well be that using more technology, that having lower well-being causes you to use more technology, or that there's a third factor that kind of causes both. For example, we know that children in low socioeconomic status households use more technologies, often because their parents have to work longer hours. There's less time for childcare face-to-face, and they also score lower on well-being. But it might be kind of some completely other thing that is causing both of these things. And so we only see that relation as a kind of spurious relation. So what we need to think about is, what is the direction of these effects? And work again with my colleagues in Oxford and Vienna, we found that actually these effects go both ways. So if a teenager uses more social media in 1 year than their own average, so if I increase my social media use, my life satisfaction a year later is predicted to have a very, very small decrease. But the opposite is also the case. If a teenager's life satisfaction drops from their own average, their social media use is predicted to have a small rise. So instead of technology kind of having effects on well-being, it's probably a really complicated network of things that are driving us to use more technologies. The technology might be affecting us, and other kind of parts of our lives would be affecting both of these as well. And so a correlation really doesn't tell us anything about this complexity. And this brings us to something that hopefully Michelle and I can talk about a bit in the discussion, and that is the need to also focus on the individual. A lot of this work just puts all teenagers in one basket, but naturally teenagers are diverse, just like we are diverse, and we need to really think about these individual differences as well. The way I explain this is often through this bar of chocolate. So when I talk to parents or journalists, it's often hard to really explain why we need to take into account the individual to really understand the effects of technology. But with diet, it's a bit easier. So for example, if we wanted to find out what effect eating this chocolate bar has on a teenager that I might just pick off my street, we actually would want to know a lot about the teenager. So for example, if the teenager is diabetic, yes, eating that chocolate bar might be really harmful, even deadly. It will be something we want to curtail, and something we would probably find quite immoral for us to give them that chocolate bar to eat. However, if the teenager has just come off the football pitch and it's halftime and or they've run a long distance, then actually the chocolate bar might be really, really helpful. We also would want to know, how often do they eat this chocolate bar? A chocolate bar every minute will have a different effect than a chocolate bar every day or every month. And their motivation. If they're eating this chocolate bar because they're really sad or lonely, we might be more concerned than if they eat it because they're really hungry. And it's the same with technology. We need to take into account these individual differences, because only when we do will we really know what the effects are. And one of these is taking account the type of user. And there's not been a lot of work on this, but we already know that, for example, teenage girls exhibit a lot more of these directional effects between social media and life satisfaction than teenage boys. So maybe teenage girls are a bit more affected than teenage boys. And this is the work that I'm currently doing at Cambridge, is trying to really think more about, are there like diabetics of social media use or not? And that's really important going forward. But we also need to think about the type of use. Social media isn't a kind of uniform thing that we can measure. Social media is really diverse, and that makes it very powerful. We can use it in different ways. We can look at different types of content. And again, that will be important to take into account if we truly want to know about its effects on mental health. A very kind of simple kind of theoretical framework of this is the distinction between active and passive use. So active use is when you chat to friends, when you use social media to actively connect to other people. And that might positively boost our social connectedness, especially in times of COVID. And that might boost our well-being. But if we use it passively, if we're just scrolling, if we don't use it for a certain reason, we're just kind of scrolling through the newsfeed, that might boost our social comparison. I might compare myself to others, who seem to have really nice lives, and I'm just sitting on my sofa scrolling through Instagram, and that might decrease my well-being. So if we lump all of these uses together, just like lumping all the users together, we'll probably not find a lot. And this is probably why we still understand so little about social media itself. So what we found is that kind of the correlation, yes, is there's a negative correlation, but it's really, really small. And it's probably just part of a really complex network of social media affecting our lives affecting how we use social media, and therefore it's really hard to quantifiably kind of get to the bottom and really figure out what the effects of social media are. And that is made even worse by that it's really individual. It's not like a drug where we have a molecule that we can measure. It's actually something, social media is dynamic. There's a lot of different types of uses, and there are a lot of different types of users that are, and as a field, there's not been a lot of work that has really kind of tried to look at that diversity. And so in the end, we're left with a lack of evidence. And this is not just me who says that. There's a lack of evidence. The chief medical officers, Dame Sally Davies, who's now head of Trinity College here in Cambridge, but she was chief medical officer last year. And she did a big investigation into screen time and found that there was insufficient amounts of evidence to support any guidelines in terms of screen time, because there's no kind of dose-response relationship. There's no clear kind of link between the two. And so she said that actually more research is needed before chief medical officers can give any sort of advice, at least in the UK. And this was also found by the Royal Society for Pediatrics and Child Health, who really said, instead of kind of saying that there's a specific limit, we need to empower parents to think about these individual differences in uses. And I'm happy to talk about this in the questions. I think their guidelines have been one of the most thought through guidelines that I've seen. And I'm very proud of the Royal Society for Pediatric and Child Health for having done this. I think they published it in 2018. So it was quite before their time to think about this diversity. So yes, what we know about screen time or social media and well-being is very, very little. It's very complicated. And so again, I hope that both this part of the talk and the previous one, thinking about, how this becomes even more complicated if we take the meta perspective, I hope that will give you a nice kind of introduction to these discussions. And yeah, thank you for listening. Sorry for overrunning for 3 minutes.
That's all right. Don't worry, because we started a little bit late anyway, so you were absolutely on time. Thank you. Very, very helpful and very informative. I guess just a couple of things relating to that before we move on to Michelle. I think you sort of addressed this a little bit in the later part of the talk, but one of the questions that came in when you were talking about the comparison that you like between social media or technology and wearing glasses. And so one of the questions that came in, said, well, there may be a small effect size in teenagers as a group if you just take them as a whole, but presumably there are some subgroups who are particularly susceptible or vulnerable. And I think you sort of went on to address that a little bit. You said in your more recent work you're maybe looking at perhaps teenage girls. Do you want to say a little bit more about those subgroups that may or may not be more susceptible or more vulnerable?
Yeah, I think part of my historical work is showing that often when a new technology comes around, we overgeneralize way too quickly. We think about the technology as a whole and how it affects vulnerable populations as a whole. And that over time, we often see that that's a major mistake. And I think that was the mistake we also made with social media. Social media isn't destroying teenagers as such, but I think where we are now is that we want to figure out, are there subgroups we should actually be concerned about? And so, yes, there's, teenage girls versus boys is still very crude. I think, it's still, you're kind of splitting people down the middle. It's very easy to actually split people down the middle, but I think we can do better. So also, I think it has big policy implications for if we really want to intervene, because if there's a small negative correlation or even a small negative effect of technologies on well-being, the question is, what's the distribution? If it's a small bell curve that is tightly around that small negative effect, then maybe we actually don't want to intervene. Everybody has that small kind of, well, it's a debate then what we should do. But it's then quite uniform across the population, which means we want to treat the whole population, or we decide just not to treat the whole population, invest into something that has a bigger positive impact if we intervene. But what if that distribution is very wide? All of a sudden we have people who are quite positively affected and people who are quite negatively affected, and the mean is the same value, but it's a very different picture. And then we would want to do something completely different. But also, what if we have kind of a bimodal distribution scientifically, like you have a peak, kind of a group that is very negatively affected, and then a group that isn't affected at all, which is kind of the diabetic thinking. You have people who are clinically really harmed by this, and then a lot of people, you might want to control what they eat, but you, as a policy, you have two very different approaches. You have kind of the population level of not putting sweets at the checkout and like very long-term thinking. But then for the people who are really negatively affected, you have treatments and you have interventions and diagnostics, and you really put money into that pot because that affects life more than the other population. And we don't know. I think and this is part of where maybe qualitative research can merge with quantitative, what I do. But I think what the work I can do can also really help going forward. So I'm excited, to have joined Cambridge last year, and I still have 3 years to go. So hopefully at some point I have some results to share.
And just following on from that, one other question that we've had addresses this issue of whether there might be significant differences in age groups who grew up with social media and have never really known a world without it, as opposed to those who are exposed to it perhaps as older teenagers. I mean, presumably that has some sort of impact, but again, it might be very difficult to determine the nature of that impact.
Yeah, I think a lot of groups use social media very differently. And we often are, the funny thing about technological concern is that we often are concerned about the other, the vulnerable group, the children, or previously it was women, women and bicycles, there was a big scare, or immigrants, because often the power holders of society that create this concern and give it voice, they don't feel like they're as affected. A lot of times when I talk to peers or adults about social media, we say, yes, we're sometimes negatively affected, but I can self-control, and I try to download this, and I can keep under control. But it's the kids, while the kids also, if you talk to them, they have ways in which they think about things. And so I think naturally different age groups have different kind of issues, but I think we often gloss over that actually there are core issues of older generations in social media, in these kind of media debates. There's older populations are the people who find it really hard to differentiate fake news from real news, who use social media maybe less, kind of more uncritically in certain time points. So I think, yes, a targeted approach will be necessary, but also social media moves really fast, which makes this research really hard. A lot of the data I use takes a year to collect, a year to clean, and then a year to write up. And then you're 3 years behind. And now kids are using TikTok completely differently. And so the core question there is, and how good is science, this slow science for understanding social media as well. I think it raises a lot of questions about, where's our place as academics in trying to figure out these questions.
Thank you. Okay, so let's move on to our second speaker this morning, so Michelle O'Reilly. Michelle is an associate professor of communication in mental health at the University of Leicester. She has an abiding interest in child and adolescent mental health, and she's focused particularly on the impact of social media, as her forthcoming book attests, and details about the book are in the program for this workshop. Like Amy, she too has repeatedly emphasized the lack of sort of rigorous empirical work, which has explored how social media influences mental health. In a recent article co-authored with several colleagues, she concluded that, like adults, adolescents, and I quote, frequently blame technology for undesirable outcomes instead of acknowledging other cultural, personal, or social factors. Now, Michelle has pre-recorded her talk as a PowerPoint presentation, so I just need to make sure that we play the right file here, and I think Shauna is going to make sure that that happens.
Okay. Okay.
Good morning and welcome to my presentation. I'm really pleased that you've decided to join us this morning. It's a really exciting topic to be talking about young people and their views of social media and mental health. This is a particularly pertinent topic in the current climate, particularly with COVID-19 and the role that digital media is playing in the well-being of children and young people at the moment. I'd like to just introduce myself first before we move on.
So I'd like to introduce myself as Dr. Michelle O'Reilly. I work for the University of Leicester, and in so doing I work across two different schools. I work for the School of Media, Communication and Sociology, and I work for the Department of Neuroscience, Psychology and Behaviour. My specialist area of research and interest then is in health. Second role, I also work in Leicestershire Partnership NHS Trust as part of the Child and Adolescent Mental Health Service, where I have a specific role in quality improvement, mentoring and supervising clinical staff.
So I consider myself to be an interdisciplinary researcher because I think that the challenge of meeting children and young people's mental health need in a modern society requires a coordinated approach across different disciplines and different organisations. And I consider myself to be really quite privileged in that I work for the university and for the NHS. And so just to give you some context for this slide, there's a few acronyms on this slide. So I'm currently based in the Child and Adolescent Mental Health Service, which is abbreviated to CAMS. For those of you who work in this field, you'll be fully aware of that. And that is in part of the larger directorate, which is the Families, Young People and Children's Service, hence the FYPC. So in my NHS role, I'm really lucky to work with a lot of experienced clinical people across a whole range of childhood mental health issues, including neurodevelopmental conditions, self-harm, suicidal ideation, and various other things. So I get to keep my research grounded in practice and policy and things that really matter on the ground. So I do work in health broadly, and my main speciality is in qualitative methods. And those are the methods where we talk to key stakeholders, including children and young people themselves, about various topics. And it's those qualitative approaches that I'm going to talk to you about this morning. So I've been working with a multidisciplinary team. Like I said, I'm a big advocate of tackling research problems from various different perspectives. And it's been really useful to have these people involved. So just very quickly to give you some context, Professor Dogra is a child and adolescent psychiatrist, a retired child and adolescent psychiatrist. So she has a specialist background in medicine and psychiatry, and that brings a kind of much needed medical perspective to the issues related to the project. There's then Professor Jason Hughes, who's a classic sociologist who works with me in the School of Media, Communication and Sociology, and he tends to bring a very societal, social problem-based perspective to the project. We were very lucky to work with Dr. Paul Riley, who works up in Sheffield, and his specialist area is in kind of media and information, and that was particularly useful when you start looking at social media and what social media's relationship is with child and adolescent mental health, to have that kind of information perspective. We also worked with Sarah Adams, who works in the School of Education. She was a former teacher herself and a former assistant head. She's got some great contacts with schools across the county and in kind of closer counties like Northampton and Lincoln and those kind of places. And so she was really instrumental in helping us get contact with different schools and in terms of making sure that our processes were child-centred and appropriate for what we were trying to achieve in our research goals. And then we also had Dr. Natasha Whiteman from the University of Leicester, who was a specialist in media and ethics. So again, particularly useful in designing our ethical protocol, going through the ethics process, but also in terms of the kind of relationship with media more broadly and how we tackled that. So that's the multidisciplinary team I worked with. I just like to give them some credit for the talk I'm going to give this morning, because the work has been heavily influenced by their disciplinary perspectives, their knowledge and their expertise. So just for context, because this is quite an important issue, that when we start talking about the relationship between social media and mental health, that needs to be placed in the broader context of children's mental health more generally. And one of the things that we've seen over the last few years, perhaps the last decade or so, is that the global statistics regarding the prevalence of certain mental health conditions seems to be rising. That is, more children are eligible for diagnosis of a particular condition than back in 2005 when the last UK survey was done. So NHS Digital in 2018 did their prevalence survey, and they found that 12.8% of children who are aged 5 to 19 years old do meet the threshold for at least one mental health condition, and 5% met the criteria for having 2 or more conditions. And it is quite common for children and young people to have comorbid conditions alongside a primary diagnosis. So this kind of gives you a global indication of what the issues are, and there's a huge amount of speculation at the moment that COVID-19 is going to contribute to those rising statistics, that we're going to see more and more children with mental health need because of the anxieties and mood disorders that it's created. We're already anecdotally seeing an increase in self-harm. The internet and technology companies are kind of reporting that they're seeing increased traffic to their kind of maladaptive websites where there's a promotion of self-harm or promotion of eating disorders. And they seem to be suggesting that more children are visiting those kind of sites during lockdown. So It's certainly concerning that we might see an explosion of referrals to CAMHS later once we're through the worst of this crisis. So just to pause for a second and let me offer my thanks to the Wellcome Trust, because they funded our project, and it's always polite to say thank you very much for the money. We wouldn't have been able to do the project without you. So I have to put that small caveat into the presentation. So to give you a little bit of context then, as I mentioned earlier on when I was introducing who I am and what I do, I'm a qualitative researcher by background. My training is in a variety of different qualitative approaches, in thematic analysis approaches, in discourse analysis, conversation analysis, and a little bit in grounded theory as well. So I'm very much in favour of talking methods where we listen to key stakeholder views and then work towards providing a synthesis of that evidence to illustrate what children and young people think. It's a very child-centred approach. It's a very child-driven approach. And what's great about qualitative methodology is that it really complements those larger scale statistics projects that give us the numbers. So the quantitative projects, like the ones that Amy talked about, they're the ones that tell us the scale of a problem and the nature of a problem. But what qualitative research then does is starts to explore that in more detail, to unpick some of the reasons for that, the rationale for it, some of the kind of children's viewpoints and opinions, so that we can start to build a much more in-depth picture of what those statistics mean in practice. So we carried out a qualitative project. We were very lucky. We had schools in the City of London and schools in the City of Leicester and Leicestershire taking part in our project. So we were able to get a fairly diverse sample of children and young people who were able to give us their views and their opinions about the relationship between mental health and social media specifically. So to achieve our goals, what we did was conducted 10 focus groups. We wanted to capture a range of different viewpoints and perspectives on the issue, so that we could start to see where there were similarities of opinion and differences of opinion, as well as exploring real-world personal experiences of the phenomena to see if we could look at what children and young people were actually doing with social media, what it meant to them, how they were using it, how much they were using it, and those kind of questions. So to do that, we were able to conduct 6 focus groups with adolescents who were aged between 11 and 18 years old, right through the high school year system, and we had 54 young people consent to participate in the project, which was great. We also ran 2 focus groups with mental health practitioners who worked in CAMHS. That was much more challenging. They're very, very busy people, but we did manage to get 8 practicing mental health professionals who were able to give us their opinions on the subject. We also conducted 2 focus groups with educational professionals, which were mostly teachers, but we did have some head teachers and teaching assistants as part of that group, and we had 16 of those educational professionals participate in the project. So we had a really eclectic mix of different perspectives and viewpoints on the relationship between social media and mental health. So in terms of what we found, it was fairly consistent with some of the literature already. What surprised us when we consulted the literature was how little of the social media and mental health literature actually talked to young people directly about it. So when we had our group discussions, we were able to conceptualize the general areas of discussion, or the young people conceptualized the general areas of discussion into what they felt was good about social media in terms of their mental health, and kind of good generally, what they felt was bad and what they felt was ugly, in their words. So what was really interesting about that is that we're not trying to endorse that there's something inherently good or bad about social media, but this was the kind of general broad conceptualization of the range of issues that the young people and the adults raised. And of course, one of the kind of pervasive arguments that exists about social media is that we mustn't forget that actually there are an awful lot of positive uses of digital media, social media, technology, the internet, all of these different things. And they're able to extend our communication, social ties, creativity. And of course, during COVID, technology has been a godsend with Zoom parties and Skype and Teams and all sorts of other things. And of course, we wouldn't be able to have this conference today if it wasn't for the platform, the digital platform that we're able to communicate on, ask questions on, and interact through. So there is a good side to this. In terms of mental health, more specifically, our young people made all kinds of comments where they appraised social media in ways that they saw as very positive for their well-being, for their identity, for their mental health, and so on. And these are the kind of comments that they made. So they said things like, it's really important because it builds up friendships, and they were very clear that close friendships were good for your well-being. So I'm not including everything that they said here in this presentation. I'm just trying to give you a flavour of the overview of the kinds of things they said. So again, it's how I communicate with friends that I don't see. So they felt it was important to stay connected to those that they weren't geographically close to. For some of the young people, they actually felt that it enhanced their social skills. It made them more social. They found it relaxing. Going on YouTube was relaxing, and it's a distraction from the things around you. And that actually, they believed, made them less stressed. Of course, the main thing that we hear is that social media is bad for your mental health. It has and the young people agreed with this. They talked about the ways in which social media could impact you negatively in terms of your well-being. And they said things like, you're taught to have low self-esteem because of Photoshop. People will target you with rude comments. There's lots of people who are nasty on social media. People get addicted to social media. And there's lots of expectations. They recognise that their age group was particularly impressionable to the negative stuff. And they felt that this could really impact on people's self-esteem particularly. And then they talked about the really extreme end, that, the stuff that we see in the press on a regular basis, the worst side about the relationship between social media and mental health. They talked about these in terms of it being an ugly side. What was particularly interesting about these things in terms of pornography, privacy violation, impact on sleep, cyberbullying, grooming, suicide, etc., is none of them had really experienced this directly, or none of them disclosed experiencing any of this directly. And they talked about it in a much more third-party attributions kind of a way, which was a very interesting study. So they said things like it's a dangerous place. People don't know how dangerous it is. It can cause suicide and depression, which is a little linear in its thinking, but it's an interesting connection that they made. That people can take advantage of you on social media. Self-harming is posted on Facebook, and cyberbullying they felt was a very problematic area of school life generally. So when we pulled together all of these three dimensions regarding the relationship between social media and mental health, we created a framework for thinking about what we can do in practice and how we can take this forward, what and how matters about this relationship. And we developed what we're calling a digital ethics of care framework, which is published in the paper on the slide if anyone wants to read the full. But just to give you a little bit of context about that, there's an ethical philosophy called an ethics of care philosophy, which is slightly different from the deontological approach that we usually see in research ethics, which is a principles-based approach. And instead, the ethics of care philosophy centres much more around people and their characteristics and their practices. And it sees morality as a central feature of social interaction. And it sees that as something that occurs between persons. So ethical philosophers from this particular perspective argue that empathy is the central characteristic needed in terms of how people practice and behave in life. Well, we feel that this is actually translated in a digital context. So we created a digital ethics of care based on our adolescents' viewpoints and perspectives. And one of the things that they promoted and we wove into our framework was this idea that actually adolescents have got agency and autonomy online. They make choices every day in terms of how they behave when they're behind a screen, and that they have to take some responsibility for the kinds of things they do online, the kind of things they seek out online, and the kind of posts and comments they make online towards others. And so the digital ethics of care framework, its goal is to promote empathy and care for others in digital spaces. And it integrates the ethics of care, virtue ethics, and children's rights by recognising the role of the child in their conduct. Now, that's not to say there's not other aspects, because of course there are. There are adult-controlled aspects of digital media. But what we're kind of moving towards focusing on is looking at children and young people's behaviour online and how that particularly impacts on mental health and well-being of a population. So I just thought that I would put up this little photograph because obviously lockdown has affected us all. It's been a very challenging year, 2020. And when I've been working very hard on my laptop and working on developing lectures and various other things, every so often I look under my chair and this is the view under my chair. This is my next door neighbour's cat who keeps breaking into my house. So just to kind of end on something a little bit more positive. So I'd like to say thank you to you all at that point. Thank you very much for listening. I'm perfectly happy if anyone would like to contact me or ask questions, or if anyone would like copies of the papers that were produced from the project, then please do feel free to get in touch. My email address is on the screen. So thank you very much. I believe now that we're going to move to some specific questions and then some more general panel style questions for Amy and I to discuss the broader issues. So thank you again for listening.
Great, thank you so much for that. Again, perhaps if just to focus on a couple of things that arise specifically from your talk, as you say, before we sort of open it up to both you and Amy. So the examples that you gave on some of those slides, the examples from the particular adolescents that you were talking to, the sort of specific examples, their perceptions of how social media affects them. To what extent is it possible to quantify those across, a sort of broader group? I mean, because presumably, anecdotal evidence or subjective feedback like that starts to acquire particular force if it's possible to sort of quantify the extent to which it's representative. I don't know if you'd like to comment on how that can be done, or whether it's indeed possible to do that.
Yeah, I mean, with qualitative research, what you get is more depth than breadth. What you get is kind of personal accounts and children's own stories. But what's really useful about qualitative work is the synthesis of it. So you sometimes get these narrative syntheses, if that's the word. Because, I mean, our study had 54 adolescents in it. There are other qualitative studies with another 54 adolescents or 80 adolescents. And so what you build is a small evidence base. And when you find that they're saying the same things across studies, then you can have more confidence that those things are transferable, if not generalizable. I mean, there's kind of academic debates about the notion of generalizability and transferability, but they start to build a stronger picture. And unfortunately, there's not a huge amount of qualitative studies that have talked to young people. There's an awful lot of questionnaires that have asked these questions and then produced some statistics in terms of numbers. But we don't have a huge amount of depth of evidence yet. It is building. There are a few studies. And I think what's particularly interesting about my work and when that connects to other people's work is that the young people who are being talked to, they're quite savvy online. They get it. They've had a good safety education from school. They recognise the risks that they're taking if they take any. And so while there are some negative impacts on those young people, like I say, photoshopped images, this kind of idealistic life from Instagram, the really severe stuff that we see in the press, they talked about that as something that happens to other people. It doesn't happen to them. And interestingly, cyberbullying fell into that category as well. None of our young people disclosed having been a victim of or a perpetrator of cyberbullying. Now, they may have been, but they certainly didn't disclose it. They talked about it as being a problem for adolescents, for their generation. But also they recognise that the issues that people face in their day-to-day offline lives are repeated in their online lives. So vulnerabilities that we see for bullying, for example, children who are bullied in the playground and have their hair pulled are also the same children who get mean comments online. So they made that connection. And when you look at the quantitative evidence in cyberbullying, that supports that notion, that actually in-person bullying and cyberbullying tend to be highly correlated. So it's not a social media phenomenon as such, it's an extension of an offline phenomenon.
One other question that's come in, again, specifically relating to the things you were discussing, to what extent are the outcomes of the focus groups discussed in your talk influenced by social media specifically rather than the internet in general? I suppose it's difficult to control for that in some ways, isn't it?
It is. You can't control for that, but I guess what's slightly problematic is, well, what's problematic in academic discourse is that there's a blurring of the lines between what constitutes social media, what constitutes digital media, what constitutes internet use, what kind of is social gaming use. But as academics, we grapple with these questions. We worry about the blurry lines between those things, but the adolescents didn't. When we asked them about social media, they included everything. They talked, Google was social media to them. So Google is a search engine that enables you to find things on the internet. That's its technical definition. But for them, Google was a form of social media. So I think the differentiation between these different things is something that matter to academics. They don't matter to young people. They just see everything, internet searching, social gaming, social media, kind of artificial intelligence technology. To them, it's all social media. They don't differentiate it. So when we were asking our questions, they were throwing all kinds of things in that we wouldn't technically define as social media, but nonetheless they did. So I guess that it's their perspective that is more important.
Yeah, and as you indicated, that's one of the interesting things that a sort of qualitative approach can reveal to us, because we might assume that, oh, everybody puts things into neat categories in this way, and of course in practice that's really the case. Maybe at this point we could bring Amy back in and sort of open this up to both of you, because it seems to me that there are number of things relating to both your talks that are of particular interest. One thing that was in my mind throughout is thinking about this from the perspective of the companies that develop these platforms, and just to sort of keep things I guess narrowed down a little bit, let's think of what we might classify as social media. So I'm thinking of things like Facebook, I'm thinking Instagram, stuff like that. And if it's the case, and I think we can say with some confidence we know that this is the case simply from accounts and various publications of people who have been actively involved in developing these platforms. So if we accept that there is a conscious effort to design them in ways that make them addictive, that cause us as users to go back or to continue using them perhaps longer than we originally intended, often for reasons of making money. If they are designed to be addictive, to what extent should those sort of design principles that underlie these social media platforms factor into assessments of the impact they have, or do you think it's safe to almost discount that? We don't necessarily need to reflect upon how they've been constructed and how they present themselves as communications platforms. We can just simply focus on the way people respond to them as users. That was just something that was in my mind while I was listening to both the talks. I don't know if either of you would like to sort of comment on that.
I'm happy to comment. So I think, like, talking to policymakers, we often end up talking about how digital platforms are now digital infrastructure. Zoom is changing how we communicate. So the design features of Zoom, that I have you in gallery view or not, or that it allows certain things, are affecting what makes us human almost, because socializing is so ingrained into kind of our species. And the same with social media. That like when I had a talk in an economics department at the beginning of lockdown, and kind of saying that we're not regulating technology properly, because we have very little idea what social media does, and when we do, it's like 10 years down the line, and changing social media then is very difficult in kind of a process of technological entrenchment. And a professor, this was still in person, kind of stood up and said, well, I think you're taking a too simplistic view. Technology, like the car, is well regulated. We have driver's licenses. We know, we have MOTs, we design roads, we study where kind of signs should be. And I was like, it took me a bit aback. And I was like, yes, actually, we have managed to regulate that technology well. But I think the core difference that I've now kind of got my mind around in the last couple of months is that the design features are openly accessible to public-facing researchers and policymakers and the public to understand. While on social media, it's all behind closed doors. So when Facebook had a big press release, I think about a year ago, that they're removing like counts from certain, at least at first in certain companies, I think in New Zealand, and they were trialing because they believed that would boost well-being. And knowing Facebook as a company, they probably had a lot of information of why that would work. They wouldn't just roll it out just for nothing. But I got asked to comment on this in various media articles, and I had no idea. We have no way of studying likes and like where you put like counts. We can't do A/B testing. We can't change the design and see what happens. While I could quit my job on a Friday evening, well, if they would hire me, then get hired by Facebook and start doing all that research and start actually understanding what design features do. While I currently have to just look at self-reported time spent on social media as my main outcome, which naturally is a big problem. So I think by having all this research and this knowledge behind closed doors, we have a big problem in actually understanding the effects of the design and even knowing whether those kind of concerns are correct or not, and also to design proper regulation in society. And so I think that is one of the major issues that we've known about for a decade and that we've not really done anything about. And often for a while, it was kind of down to us researchers to create links with companies and, get their data and analyze it. But, I've been doing this research for 6-7 years now, and it's never really worked. You're asked to sign NDAs that you can't sign. Your kind of public trust is on the line. If I would be funded by Facebook, it'd be like a lot of people would say it's like funded by cigarette companies, And so there needs to be a policy solution. And that's something that colleagues of mine have been just pressing for years now, is that we need some way of sharing data. And there are issues, but there are also ideas. But I think that's the core thing. We just don't know. So there's no answer about designs and addiction and kind of how design features affect kids or other populations, because we have no idea. We need to rely on whistleblowers who also, naturally the Social Dilemma and those films out of Silicon Valley, they're also not really done in collaboration with scientists on the ground. A lot of us feel like they are overhyped. But there is no way of testing it. I think that's the sad part. And that's where I say, I don't want more funding. We don't need more funding in this area. We need the raw materials to actually understand. I think that's a really sad thing at the moment. Sorry, rant over.
It's a good rant. Anything you'd like to add on that, Michelle, or presumably some agreement there from you, I would imagine?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's really tricky with the technology companies because they're so huge, they're so multi-billion-dollar, and they're so internationally spread that individual countries' legal frameworks and regulatory frameworks, it's difficult to apply them because they're not tied to a specific country quite often. I do think that they have some responsibility for at least thinking about the impact that they have on a generation of children's mental health or the potential risks that it might pose. But how that gets implemented is really, really challenging, because it's a bit like with the smoking thing, and that tobacco analogy, it fits really well, because basically you're asking tobacco companies to engage in activities that's going to reduce their profit margins, and ultimately the goal is to eradicate smoking because it's so bad for public health. And so you're asking a company to take a track that's going to see them go bust, and no company is going to do that. So what you then get is a rhetorical positioning of looking like you're doing something positive for the public good, when actually you maintain a stance that's going to protect your profit margin. And I think that technology companies are in the same position. You know, the kind of the Facebook thing of removing harmful content from their platform, and the claim that they spend millions of pounds to monitor videos that are posted, and the same with YouTube. But I can't remember what the statistics were. I don't know whether you know, Amy, but it's so many million YouTube videos are uploaded every minute of the day across the world or something. And how realistically can you police that? So the regulation then becomes important for children in terms of parental filters. It becomes a much more individual family-led thing in terms of putting parental filters on the internet, putting safeguards in place, talking to the child to make sure that they're well supported. I don't think society can rely on the tech companies to do it, even though I do think they ought to do more.
I think just to kind of, you know, I feel a bit bad that there's no tech company perspective. You know, what I think there are people in tech companies who see this as an issue, who want to make a difference, who want to figure out data sharing. But it's really difficult in terms of privacy. So, for example, like I've had conversations with Partner for Digital Culture, Media and Sport around, you know, could you, for example, make the screen time app data openly available so that we know how much screen time everybody's using, and that's anonymized, you know, would that help? But as a psychologist, so I think for sociologists maybe, or political scientists, that sort of level of information can be helpful. But going back to the chocolate bar or calorie or dietitian analogy, it's like then me knowing how much sugar everybody eats in the UK. It doesn't help me understand what a guideline should be, because we might all be over consuming or under consuming. And so then having some basic demographics might allow me to know the average sugar consumption of women between 40 and 50. But again, it doesn't help me with the guidelines. I need personal tracking information to actually start really figuring out what effects are. And that means you start getting into very much de-anonymized data land. And I think that's an issue we need to think about. The Wellcome Trust has had some great ideas. You know, the government is thinking about this data levy very hard. So I think in the next year, we'll hopefully see changes. But it is, I think, one of those crucial elephants in the room of any of these discussions that, yeah, we won't have huge progress without having some sort of information like this.
Okay, and just to go back to one of the questions that was asked earlier in the chat, and I think in different ways you both sort of touched on it in your talks, but it might be worth saying a bit more about it. So the question is there any study on the relationship between social media activity and offline social activity, you know, whether there is a positive or negative correlation and whether it varies amongst different groups? And I think, you know, it was Michelle who sort of touched on this, you know, with things like cyberbullying. You know, children at school who are cyberbullied are probably also physically bullied as well. So for certain types of interaction, there might be a sort of, I suppose, almost a reinforcing of behaviour in a physical space and in a virtual space. But I don't know whether there's anything there you want to expand on a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, Sonia Livingston's done quite a lot of work in this area. Her work is really well known. One of the kind of, she's been working on social media, digital media across European children and adolescents for, oh goodness, it's got to be over a decade or so. But one of the kind of concluding things that she recently published was that you know, the nature of the child or young person, their kind of personality, their temperament, their socializing style, their risk-taking behavior, everything you can kind of think of that makes your child unique in their offline world translates to the online world. And Amy touched on this as well in her talk about the, you know, the individual differences, the individual child and young person. They're not a homogenous group. And what Sonia concluded was that certain groups, and again, this was another question, I think, certain groups of children and young people are more vulnerable to the potential harms of the online world than other groups of children, because their offline vulnerabilities translate to the online context. So she named a few groups. I can't remember what they all are, but there's a few groups. So one of the groups was children with diagnosed severe mental health conditions. So children who've got severe depression, OCD, eating disorders, and so on, they're more vulnerable offline, which makes them more vulnerable online. Looked after children are another group of vulnerable kids who particularly have, again, the statistics research shows that they have poorer life outcomes in terms of education, employment, and so on in the offline world, and they're again more vulnerable online. So there is definitely this bi-directional relationship between how children and young people are and behave and their characteristics just in the offline world, translating to the online world. And I think we're starting to see some work that actually says that this arbitrary distinction between what is off and online isn't as clear-cut as it used to be either, because so much of what we do in our offline lives is an extension of our online lives and vice versa. So it's an interesting argument.
It always amuses me at meetings when, you know, an issue gets discussed and it's clearly too complicated to resolve. And I mean, in physical, in-person meetings, and someone always says, "Oh, we better take this offline." And you think, well, strictly, we're not online here. We're sitting side by side talking about this, or we used to be. So, you know, I think the way we use those phrases is often revealing. Okay, just picking up on some of the questions that came in that we haven't addressed explicitly yet. There was one earlier. So is there any research into the link between screen time and social media among populations who are not generally considered to be vulnerable? For instance, it says wealthy white men in their 30s. Any thoughts?
Very less, naturally. There's less data collected in that space. You know, I'm doing a bit of work now on social media across the lifespan, and while the UK government collects annual social media data for anybody, I think under 26, it becomes every 3 years for everybody over 26, which means that it's very hard to then statistically figure out long-term effects, because you would be like predicting their life satisfaction from their social media use 2 years ago, which like theoretically makes no sense anymore. So I think there's been a lack of research in this area, but I think it's even in kind of less vulnerable groups. For example, in adolescence, kind of going back to Michelle's previous answer about vulnerabilities. We have a lot of information that kind of offline vulnerabilities map to online, but I think some of them haven't. Like I did a big project with Barnardo's trying to look at disadvantaged children, and we have this general assumption that disadvantaged children will fare worse, and the results were a lot less clear. So it sometimes felt like it was actually the kind of sometimes quite privileged girls who were the most affected by kind of time spent on screen, the longitudinal. But I haven't published it because I'm still not sure why. So it could be that your life satisfaction is just way more predicted by whether you get a good breakfast, whether you don't have any problems at home, whether your parents have enough money for certain things, in a low socioeconomic status background. So statistically, I only pick up the effect of social media on life satisfaction long term in those very privileged who are, if you think about kind of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, it's like a pyramid. And so, maybe at the top, social media might make a difference if you're like already having a really good life. And so if you kind of look at thin models too much, it might really affect you. But if you're actually really struggling on kind of more basic needs, it might be less so. But we know very little. And I feel like, again, I think we need to think a bit more about kind of different areas of society, because it could, if it, for example, sometimes affects very privileged children more, it might also tell us why there's so much societal debate about it, because I find it's often, if something is discussed in the media or by politicians, often because they personally feel like it's an important issue. That's often because they have teenagers, especially teenage girls, who they feel like they're overusing. It definitely was part of, Jeremy Hunt had 3 teenage girls at the time when he got really into social media as an issue. And so I don't know, it interests me personally. But yeah, we haven't done a lot of work on kind of the less vulnerable groups, which I guess shows again how a lot of technological concern or public concern in general, if we look at sociological research on moral panics, is often about the vulnerable groups and not the power holders in society.
I think that's a really interesting issue, Amy. And it's something I'm particularly interested in, this kind of notion of privilege. We've been doing some interviews with children in Brazil who, very low resource, challenge about their social media use. It's been in the context of therapeutic intervention, so that the study's not directly about social media. It's been a bit of a caveat of mine that I've stuck into the interviews just out of my own personal interest. And I was quite surprised that they appraise social media really quite positively on the whole. I mean, we haven't done a full analysis of the project yet, so I don't want to speak too prematurely, but from initial coding and initial listening to these children, they're kind of 8 to 15, and they've got a lot of good stuff to say. They talk about their phones and how important their phone is, and they talk about the impact of lockdown in Brazil, and how it was their phones that kept them going. It was being able to still talk to their friends over WhatsApp predominantly, and a couple of other things. So, yeah, I think we do absolutely have to be careful to make sweeping generalizations about disadvantage based on a particular demographic or characteristic like socioeconomic indice or age or, I don't know, anything else.
No, and I think, like, I have a PhD student I co-supervise now who looks at kind of populations in India, and a lot of the questions we're asking just don't make any sense. I find it quite difficult to supervise her at times, because it's like, it's not about whether kind of changes in well-being, it's about access, and that key need to access technology to even get a certain level of education, for example, now. So I think we need to think about kind of diverse countries as well. I do feel like the screen time debate is very Western, a very privileged debate. The same with, we often have I feel like our internal theoretical framework as a society for technology is what psychologists call the displacement hypothesis, that every hour spent on screens is an hour not doing something inherently somehow better. I feel like that question about socializing online, offline also edged in that direction. We have this assumption that if my child does an hour of video games, it's displacing an hour spent playing the piano, or an hour playing outside, or an hour playing with friends. And again, that's a very privileged assumption to make. What if an hour spent on video games means you're not an hour spent in a very high crime neighborhood? Then that might be a positive, or that actually the educational content you get online is better than what the alternative would be. We've seen a lot lower juvenile delinquency in certain aspects in certain years, and so I think we need to diversify that basic assumption as well. And COVID has done it in a way, and like during lockdown, a lot of people are like, "Oh, I'm thinking about it way differently," and I was like, "Yeah, but it's because the displacement doesn't work anymore, because an hour of your child spent on Discord talking to their friends while playing video games, like the alternative would be not talking with their friends at all, and so I think COVID has changed, but the core issue hasn't been solved. What's the worth of 1 hour online in terms of our general life? I think that will take a lot longer to figure out.
Just picking up on some of the questions that have just come in, there's one that picked up on something I think you said earlier, Amy, when you said we don't necessarily need more funding, we need access to the data to do this research. And yet, if it really does take, sort of 2 years or 3 years or so to analyze that data and to produce kind of, meaningful scientific results from looking at that data, can we ever catch up with as it were, the current state of social media? Because there'll just be a constant 3-year lag, even if we had, complete access to all the data instantaneously.
I think naturally there's a speed issue. For example, we'll never catch up to minute changes in how people use technologies. But I think we do need to rethink our system of collecting data about technologies. As another thing that I've been campaigning about is that oftentimes we start collecting information about a technology when we start becoming concerned. So a lot of studies about social media were funded in 2017 when the first kind of wave of people being concerned about social media emerged. And then naturally that's kind of too late because you want the answers then. And the UK government and the US government, other governments, they do collect a lot of data about their citizens on an annual basis, part of the census, as part of Understand Society or a Millennium Cohort Study or PSID, whatever the acronyms are. And I do think if we had a more forward-thinking funding model, forward-thinking data collection model, we could at least have the data at the time when we want to analyze it. And that means collecting data before we think that technology might become important. So collecting data about smart toys now, or augmented reality or virtual reality, and doing that well, and seeing it as maybe a risk in terms of, yes, maybe we collect information, we spend money on collecting this and we'll never need it. But actually seeing that if we don't, and we actually do become concerned, then there's that huge opportunity cost having not done it. And so I do feel like, could we have like a technology task force that tries to think what technology is on the horizon that we want to know more about, and how do we integrate that into data collection? And it often only needs to be a couple of questions, do you use this? So I think it just needs to be a bit of a change. Naturally, that won't help in kind of the smaller scale, but I think we can try to rethink on a larger scale.
And one other question that's probably directed slightly more towards you, Michelle, relates to the relationship between offline and online activity that we've already touched on. And it's really just asking whether there are any results specifically on positive effects, such as keeping in touch with your friends, which again you sort of mentioned. But are there any quantitative results, that give us some information about the extent to which there can be a positive effect in those kind of interactions?
Yes, there are. Yeah. So the EU Kids Online study is worth looking up from LSE, the London School of Economics. They look at both things. So they do really large-scale surveys, questionnaires with thousands of kids across Europe, and they do country comparisons. And they kind of illustrate how children are using social media, what social media they're using, and then they look at both the positive and negative impacts of that on well-being, on mental health, and on other domains of life, family relationships, communication ties. So it's a huge, great study, and they do show that there are positive effects of engaging with digital media broadly, in terms of maintaining friendships, communication ties, relaxation, de-stressing, those kind of things. So yes, the statistical evidence is there as well.
And I think, again, talking about different populations, there's been work on, for example, neurodiverse populations, or, if you're in the countryside and you don't have anybody to talk to who's like you, that their social media can have a major positive impact as well. So I think there's both kind of on the average, if we're average across everyone, but also we need to think about those personal stories. And there's some really great ones. I can try to find a link. If anybody's interested, there was a radio program on people sharing their kind of positive social media experience as well, which I felt was quite nice to listen to. Thanks a lot.
And there's also the kind of people jump to conclusions a little bit. So there's some evidence with Childline and the NSPCC to suggest that actually the communities of practice style stuff, where small groups form online to support each other, like self-harm websites, that there's a big difference between the kind of websites that promote self-harm and those that support self-harm, but they get kind of grouped together as self-harm websites. But actually, when a young child especially, is self-harming and they don't know why they're doing it, they're worried about it, they don't want to talk to parents, they often turn to Google first, and they can engage in these communities of practice. And the challenge with the communities of practice is that they can be negative, because they can actually actively encourage the child to continue self-harming and not seek help. That's the problematic side. But the positive side is that they can actually be really supportive and therapeutic and help the child to realise that, I'm not the only one like this. I'm not a freak. This is, there are other people doing this behaviour too. So it's a bit of a double-edged sword on that. And I think the problem is that we don't really have enough research to really understand the scale of that problem.
Just keeping an eye on the clock, we're pretty much at the end of things. There's just a couple of things here that we haven't touched on. So perhaps as a sort of final question, one thing that's been raised in the chat is the extent to which the type of social media platform may have a significant impact on the sorts of events or effects rather that result from the interaction. So, it's easier for a child at school perhaps to be bullied on Facebook, where things aren't necessarily anonymous, whereas there are other social media platforms where anonymity is much more easily maintained. The anonymous platforms may have other forms of perhaps negative or positive influence over their mental health, but you don't necessarily know that you're interacting with, a particular individual who maybe you've spent the day interacting with in a sort of physical space. I mean, again, for both of you, just quite briefly, just to end with really, to what extent do you think focusing on the different kinds and different subtypes of social media is an essential part of understanding the behaviour?
There is some work on this, and I can't remember who it was. Amy may remember who it was, but they showed that there are some social media platforms that seem to have a greater level of detrimental effect than others. Instagram was definitely cited, and I think that goes back to Amy's point about teenage girls, that teenage girls kind of put more stake into Instagram because it's a very visual thing. Whereas YouTube was considered to be much more positive because people listen to music and engage in kind of leisure style activity using YouTube. Although, again, the negative comments can be problematic. So there is a literature out there that kind of differentiates different social media platforms and looks at the effect. I wish I could remember who did the study.
It's the Royal Society for Public Health. And I've been in an internal struggle with them because I actually really don't like that study. I think it's really badly done. It's it asked people to kind of rate. They had 10 things. It gives me FOMO. It makes me think about my appearance. And then people rated which social media platform they think was worse or better. And I was this is my undergrads could have done something a bit better, in terms of there was no control if they use it or how much they use it or kind of measurement as such. But it was published in The Economist. It's still the major thing in the field. This idea of Instagram being more harmful comes back into that study, which I have written op-eds about it, and it's it was my first personal feud in 2017 as a graduate student. So I think there has been kind of more work on that now, but it has become a sort of trope, which I often find quite interesting. But yeah, do have a look at my Medium if you're at all interested in my rants about that. I think on the other side, yes, naturally platforms are important, but I think at least as a researcher, we need to take the perspective what will bring more research progress. And so I often find it quite hard when people swap to different platforms because we don't have a theoretical framework of why one might be more harmful. So all of a sudden people are studying TikTok, but it feels really disjointed as a research area. There's not a lot of there's what I would want if I could think about how we could do it better, it would be to really then have a hypothesis about one design feature that differs from one to another, and then test that specifically, and then take another design feature and build up a theoretical framework of, teenagers at a certain age are really, we know their brain reacts differently to social comparison. And so we're going to, and maybe this one social media platform allows social comparison in another way. And so we're going to test that, and it's theoretically grounded. And I think that would make a much more productive area. So I think there's a lot of problems in moving one from one platform to another, because they'll always change, and then we'll forget the research that's done before, and it seems very like whack-a-mole, which is, I guess, kind of sometimes what we need. But also in the long term, as a person in the area, I feel like we're not getting anywhere. We're just playing, whack-a-mole over time. And so I think we need both. I think it's part of that reflection again of what is different now. New technologies are more alike to older technologies. So we need to think about, what makes social media different and what makes that platform different. And then hopefully, if we get more data access, we can start testing those differences in a more controlled way. So yes, I think platforms make all the difference, even though I hate one of the studies passionately. But I think we need to think about how to study that well. And I think part of that will go back down to data access.
And I think the other point, Amy, in that as well is that it kind of treats children and young people as if they only use one platform. And of course they don't. They'll be using Instagram, YouTube, WhatsApp, Snapchat. That it would be very unusual to find a child or a young person that's just using one form of social media only and isn't using any of the other. And so this idea that you can say one platform is causing X and all the other stuff they use is not causing X, it feels like a step too far as well.
They use them at the same time as well. It makes it all very difficult.
I think that's probably an appropriate clause to end on. It's all very difficult, but well worth, I think, discussing it at length. Thank you both for participating this morning. Really useful talks and I think really interesting and relevant discussion there. I hope those of you attending who asked your questions, I hope you managed to get to most of them. There might have been one or two that we didn't quite get to, but as I say, I'm just aware that we're a bit over time already. If you're joining us for the second session of this 2-day workshop, that will start at 2:00, and that's British summertime, although it doesn't really feel very much like summer in the UK at the moment, but nonetheless it's still officially British summertime. So there's time for you either to get some lunch or to get some breakfast or to get some dinner or whatever, because I know we've got people from various time zones here. So as I say, if you're signed up for that one, we'll see you in about an hour's time or so. But in the meantime, I'd just like to thank our two speakers this morning for a really interesting session. Yeah, we can give our little sort of virtual round of applause. There we go.
Thanks.
But yeah, thank you both so much, and I hope it was enjoyable for you as well.
Thank you.
Okay, so I think we'll end things there.